Our next speaker is Gossett. Gossett is a Black, non-binary femme writer and critical theorist specializing in queer trans studies, aesthetic theory, abolitionist thought, and Black study. They received their doctorate in women's and gender studies from Rutgers University, New Brunswick in May 2021. They received a BA in African American Studies from Morehouse College, an MAT in Social Studies from Brown University, and an MA in History from the University of Pennsylvania, and were a 2019-2020 Helena Rubinstein Fellow in the Whitney Independent Study Program. Che is currently the Racial Justice Postdoctoral Scholar with the Initiative for a Just Society at Columbia Law School. Che recently received a Ruth Steffen Fellowship from the Beinecke Library at Yale University for the summer of 2022. Che will also be a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School's Animal Law and Policy program for the fall 2022 semester. Spring semester 2023, they will be spending time at Oxford University as a visiting fellow at the Center for Life Writing at Wolfson College and the Rothermere American Institute, as well as the Center for Visual Culture at the University of Cambridge. They are joining us in the internet. Please join me in welcoming Che Gossett.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to present. I wish it could only be in person. I want to open by thanking the Program in Gender and Sexuality Women's Studies, the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies as well at Penn, and my fellow co-panelists. What I'm going to be talking about today is in relationship to my work around abolition and art. And my work traces or thinks through the ways in which Black contemporary artists activate abolition as both a historical, well, through the register of the historical and the grammar of the historical, but also through the grammar of futurity, as abolition remains both an unfinished event and an open invitation to radical revolutionary reconstruction. Thinking about the legacy of Angela Davis and, of course, W.B. Du Bois and the ways in which abolition puts pressure on the category of the human, on the configuration of the political, democracy, and also the ways in which queer and trans abolitionist activism have insurgently, since some of the historical figures have contributed to this project that I'll be talking about, insurgently challenged the coordinates, expanded abolitionist imaginaries externally and also internally, kind of in the abolitionist interior, meaning like the ways in which abolition has evolved as a political horizon and social horizon. And so I'm thinking about how the aesthetic, the role it plays in abolition, and how abolitionist Black trans artists are thinking through in a kind of affirmative speculation, an aesthetic kind of pedagogy that we might attune ourselves to, and to think about what's being transmitted through that in relationship to trans-affirming pedagogies. So I'm going to focus on the work of two artists today for this brief talk. The first is actually my sibling, the artist and writer and activist Tourmaline, who is based in New York City. So I'm going to share my screen so I can show some work. And this quote by Saidiya Hartman frames the theoretical kind of intervention that my work aims to make and be situated in, which is that of Black feminist, trans, and Black radical thought, and even as those are inseparable, obviously. The afterlife of slavery is not only a political and social problem, but an aesthetic one as well. Tourmaline's film Salacia, and these images are from Chapter New York, which is the gallery where Salacia has had kind of many residences, including at the MoMA and other galleries and iterations, actually at the Venice Biennale, which was a really incredible event and space in which to see this work. And Salacia itself refers to underwater, subterranean gods of the sea. And this is Mary Jones. And these are all kind of brief shots from the film. And in the film, Mary Jones, who is a historical figure who was criminalized as a Black trans sex worker, arrested in 1836 in New York City, and made a kind of sensationalist, kind of the object of a sensationalist media sensationalism, where a poster was created of Mary Jones, calling her the man monster, and it circulated as a lithograph in a kind of viral way for that time period. And yet, Mary Jones was also defiant in her abolitionist sociality and aesthetic sociality as well. And so when she was accosted by the judge at the court in New York, and this is where I first found out about this actually by reading Tavia Nyong'o's amalgamation schemes, and then ordering the transcript of this interrogation, really, she was asked, why do you dress this way? And her rejoinder to the judge is that she's always dressed this way amongst people of my own color. And so that kind of always as a temporal index helps us to think through the not only the contemporaneity, the historical present of Black transness, which is often kind of portrayed as a sort of new identity formation. And instead, I think it opens up questions about Black trans and gender nonconformativity and the historical register itself. And in the film, there's a kind of critical fabulation at work through Tourmaline's intervention, where Jones is part of a Black community in, what is now Central Park, that was destroyed as part of the creation of Central Park. And in this community, there's a kind of radical sense of intimacy, but one that isn't a sort of flat intimacy or a kind of empty or like vacant intimacy, but one that actually has a lot of texture, and sometimes there's a rub between members of the community. And so one of the major figures of the community in this film is Peter Dermott, who's a Black abolitionist newspaper editor. And he, in the film, kind of disagrees with Mary Jones's sex work choices. And so there's this kind of internal intramural friction and dialogue that's all about like the politics of racial respectability, but it's really powerful and interesting because the whole community itself is under duress and criminalized. So there's no kind of recourse to a sort of figuration of the innocent subject, and rather they're all navigating various forms of criminalization, which is one of the forms that anti-Blackness, legal anti-Blackness takes, of course. And so there's a kind of radical fugitivity at work here, that where the versions of it kind of bounce off each other in a really vibrant and exciting and troubling and interesting way. And so the film also plays with temporality. So Jones herself is able to call upon and rely upon African spiritual cosmological traditions. And so we can think here of religions, syncretism. For instance, candomblé would be like a version of that, for example. And she uses this as a way to speculate. And speculation here is multi and polysemic. I would say. So on the one hand, speculation is a form of seeing into the future and that kind of imaginary. On the other hand, speculation is a way of kind of actualizing that future. And so it's a form of praxis. And so she's able to jump. And in this way, time is kind of folded in the film. And so Jones, who is being chased by the police, escapes into the future. But that future is not an escape. As we know, the anti-Blackness of the afterlife of slavery lives on in the historical present. So there's some really interesting questions that are raised about abolition itself. Like, what would it take to create a space and a topography, a political landscape in which Jones is a liberated person, and how does the imaginary, speculative contribute to this kind of project? Also, what's really fascinating about the film is that not only time is folded, but kind of presences and realities. So there's a kind of documentary intervention and thread that also weaves throughout the film. So here we're looking at Sylvia Rivera being interviewed actually as an unhoused person. She was living in an encampment, and she's remarking what she did over the course of her life, often to Marsha Johnson, about the River Jordan. And it's the quote here says, "You've got to keep fighting, girlie, because it's not time for you to cross the River Jordan." And she's laughing about it. And so Marsha and Sylvia often thought about the River Jordan as a crossing point between life and death, or the border between life and death, and the border or a threshold rather, less of a border, more of a threshold, a point of contiguity, because there in Marsha and in Sylvia and in Jones, in this speculative historical imaginary, there's an aesthetic pedagogy, but there's also this kind of like spiritual pedagogy. And so in Marsha's life, in Sylvia Rivera's life, there was a cosmological and Black and brown trans spiritual practice that they relied on, which is also being kind of dramatized through Mary Jones's portrayal here as well in Silesia. And so there's a dialogue happening that's co-presences, that is not about this kind of obsession with death and the kind of figuration of Black transness, Black trans woman in particular, is the kind of melancholic, abject subjects in need of rescue, and this kind of like instrumentalization of Black trans death that Riley Norton and Jan Harita Warren have written about so powerfully in their piece on trans necropolitics. But rather, this is thinking through like, what are the practices and pedagogies that are at work. And this is Jones imprisoned. She was imprisoned at Sing Sing, and she uses magic to fly and transport herself rather to the present. And the film closes with a really powerful line: "We can be anything we want to be." The other artist that I want to mention here is Keon Williams, who's a Black trans artist based in New York City, and who has done really phenomenal work around Blackness and ecology, Black transness and ecology. And I want to focus on one piece by Williams, and it's called Meditations on the Making of America. And so I wanted to preface this with a quote from Nahum Chandler from his book, the problem of the Negro as a problem for thought, where he brings Du Bois to bear on ontology, the political, and the historical present, both in that text and then also a newer text called Beyond This Narrow Now. So it is widely believed that a real thing called America exists. Yet it is precisely this idea of America in itself that we should not accept without examination. And so this examination and this deconstruction, this kind of reconfiguration, throwing into crisis the sovereignty, which is, of course, racial and colonial, structured by securitization, is the very object of Williams's work, Meditations on the Making of America. And so in this work, which is incredibly moving, the audience is situated behind what Williams calls a vessel, a womb, an abyss. And this is an indexing of the work of Gossett, Kamal Braithwaite, and also, of course, Saidiya Hartman's work, Venus in Two Acts, where she thinks about the slave ship as a vessel, and also, of course, the work of Hortense Spillers, where she thinks through the Middle Passage and it's kind of violent, or violent is too polite a word, but it's destructive ontological force. And so dirt or soil from this womb or abyss or crypt is projectile thrown at the canvas until it forms the kind of topography of America. And this is an image of Williams after that happens. And also Williams in different performances will use a kind of hair as whip to construct the soil into the shape of the American nation state as it is now. But it's always referencing to the Caribbean because the soil itself actually was transported from St. Croix, which is where Williams's family is from. And so it references the making of America. A meditation on the making of America is also, in this case, a meditation on the making of the Caribbean as well. And so what's really fascinating about this piece, aside from the beauty of it, and is these cup fungi that are growing inside the soil. And Williams isn't only interested in the kind of destruction, but also in this question of livability. And they have written and spoken about the ways in which the cup fungi dramatize and illustrate how life persists even in conditions in which it might be imagined that it's not hospitable, and that life itself is extinguished and so imperiled that it's impossible to imagine its persistence. And yet their life does flourish. And so this is about a kind of pedagogy around that. And there's a closer view. And it's also obviously, Williams is always thinking through the kind of eco-poetics of Blackness and life. And then finally, this is a image from a piece that Williams did in relationship to the archive and critical fabulation that deals with the material from it is kind of excavated from Marlon Briggs's archive, which is held at Stanford, where Williams was an undergraduate, and helped to research and process the archive. And Briggs's film Brother to Brother, and also Black Is, Black Ain't, there's Black transness imminent and intramural and moving and activated in those works. And so Williams found footage with Jessie Harris, who's a Black trans femme person who was in the films, and reconstructs it. And in the actual exhibit itself, there's mirrors that are placed in front, kind of hanging in front of this video of Harris. And it is a kind of confrontation and thinking through about Blackness, AIDS, the archive, via the speculative, via critical fabulation, and conversations with history, really. And so at different points, Williams has kind of interfaced with this, and then at other points as part of the exhibit, where I saw it, it was called "Nobody Promised You Tomorrow," which is a quote from Marsha P. Johnson, and that was at the Brooklyn Museum. That was a kind of event where the kind of logic or museumological logic of the space meant that you as a spectator were mirrored in this way, and kind of having this conversation about Black trans, AIDS, historicity, the archive, and critical fabulation reimagining this archive and thinking about the aesthetic and political resonances to today. So these are all, I think, part of an essential part of having a conversation around transforming pedagogy, Blackness, the role of art, and the kind of transmission, pedagogy as a transmission, and aesthetic education, and a relationship between past and present that I think, and I hope, might be one that we can all discuss. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Che. That was wonderful.